Our next session is going to focus on the energy sector and the changes it is facing due to rapidly shifting market forces. The session is going to be moderated by Ken Nemeth. Ken has served as the Southern States Energy Board's Secretary and Executive Director since February, can I say this year? Of 1975. My goodness. We're proud of you, Ken. You've stuck it out for a long time. SSEB, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is an interstate compact committed to enhancing economic development and the quality of life through innovations in energy and environmental policies, programs, and technologies. And its members include the 16 southern states, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, all of who have some folks here today. So Ken, if you would lead us in this important discussion, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diane. This afternoon, as Diane mentions, we're going to talk about market forces changing the electricity industry, and by virtue of that also hit on issues such as energy resources and energy resource development. I'm going to use some baseball anecdotes this afternoon, since we are in a town that has one of the best ballparks in the United States, and it's just unfortunate, or we'd probably be overrun with people ready for the game tonight. But I also want to mention, in lieu of what Diane said, that this is my 46th Southern Governors meeting. I say Southern Governors, I won't say association, because back when I started it was called the Southern Governors Conference. And now, of course, and then changed to Southern Governors Association. But I want to thank Diane and her staff for selecting this as a topic to be discussed this afternoon. There are very serious market forces changing and shaping the electric industry, and they're important to us all as consumers and for the industry that is trying to respond to them. The path we choose to take will determine our future. And speaking of paths, it seems that with the new EPA regulations targeting coal, the low cost of natural gas, the dispatch problems that are being faced by nuclear, cheap oil, an aging workforce, an aging power plant fleet, and a number of other issues, former Yankee great Yogi Berra said it all. When you come to a fork in the road, take it. And basically, we are at that fork in the road. Since we have this theme going, I'm so happy to be in St. Louis. Some of you will remember Bob Gibson, who was a Hall of Fame pitcher with the Cardinals some 50 years ago. He pitched 255 complete games. He had 56 shutouts, and he also won 251 games. There are very few pitchers who complete even one game, as we all know, in this day and age. And we all remember Lou Brock. In fact, I've seen his picture in this hotel about 4 or 5 times, who stole 118 bases in 1974, but he was probably more famous for something that happened after he quit playing, and that is he invented this thing called the Brock umbrella, which was basically an umbrella that fit on your head. And I see some of you older people in the background shaking your heads like, yes, I remember that. But that was, and of course, I couldn't get off the stage without mentioning Stan the Man Musial and Red Shandy, some of my heroes from when I was a child. But it's important to note, I think, that also that St. Louis won 100 games this year, more than any other team in the National or American League. And that's significant because most of the time the team that wins the most games doesn't end up playing for in the World Series. And sure enough, this was another year just like that. But as baseball has aged and changed over time, so has the electric energy grid system in the U.S. I'll Get it right there, yeah. So we can see what a hodgepodge event this is and how we're having to work with it now and in the future. The grid is beginning to look really different from the days of Bob Gibson and the 1964 Cardinals, who beat the vaunted New York Yankees in Game 7 of the World Series on this very day, 51 years ago. Kind of interesting, I thought. Today, our panel of distinguished experts is going to discuss market forces that are shaping and transforming the landscape of the electric industry, the way we generate, transmit, and use energy, as well as several challenges the industry faces that are new and need our attention. There are a number of them. There are environmental regulations such as EPA's 111B and 111D regulations affecting new and old power plants, and these regulations have caused havoc in the states and in the industry, and now 16 state attorneys general have filed suit. The EPA's Clean Power Plan requires further changes in the use of various energy resources for electric generation, and we're going to talk about that this afternoon. The cost of natural gas has declined to such an extent that it's replacing coal and challenging the dispatch of viable nuclear stations, such as Vermont Yankee and Kewaunee in Wisconsin, both of which have recently closed, even though they are viable plants. Technology costs are declining substantially for solar and wind projects, and today, large-scale utility solar PV is about half the cost of rooftop solar. There is a diversification of energy resources, and fuel choices are paramount to a viable and healthy electric energy grid system. We remember the polar vortex from just this past winter and the winter before that, when if we did not have viable coal plants and nuclear plants that were operating at that time, the Northeast would have faced a series of very serious blackouts. And yet those are the very plants that are intended to be closed over time. Federal financial incentives are another key factor. We have seen the renewable energy technologies such as solar and wind that are gaining and being more and more demonstrated, to the point that the U.S. Department of Energy has a $3 billion budget for solar and renewable, and a $559 million budget for coal and fossil energy resources. State renewable energy policies are changing, and we have 29 states now that have a renewable portfolio standard, and another 8 states have goals for renewable energy as well. Customer demand is becoming another driver. As we produce more electric and hybrid vehicles, we need charging stations at work and at home. So consumers also want net metering so they can sell their solar energy back to the utility if they don't use it. Workforce development, as we've discussed earlier today, is a key component of future stability and economic security. The average age of management in the utility industry is 61 years old. So not only do we need to replace these managers, we also need to train managers in the development and use of new technologies and systems. I want to mention electricity transmission as well, because it is in new and exciting ways, it is changing. And one of the things that I want to talk about are synchrophasers, or phasor measurement units that are being added to the electric grid to measure instantaneous voltage, current, and frequency at specific locations on the grid at a rate of 30 to 60 or more records per second. This information should mean better transmission, reliability, fewer generalized power outages, and save money. High voltage DC transmission lines will also connect wind farms in the Midwest to load centers in the East. and the location of new generating sources will create different flow patterns and ultimately create the need for additional transmission. Today, Jeff Price will talk to us about the consumer of the future, the prosumer, who in 2050, just 35 years away, will be much more in tuned and established in the way that they use electricity. The days of flipping a switch are over if you want to talk about the energy system. People now are building their homes much more efficiently to building standards that are 30% more efficient than even 10 years ago. They're comparing their home energy use to their neighbors using a home energy rating system. They track production from solar panels as the summer peak load hits. They use their Nest learning thermostat system to turn loads off and on remotely. And we did that last night. As a matter of fact, we were sitting there, and our federal representative, Jim Powell, who is here today, was turning on and off his air conditioning in Georgia and in Florida at 2 different homes. So all of these things are real, and they're happening today. Our utility boardroom and state public service commissions can no longer depend on the traditional equation in which revenues are strictly focused on the cost of electricity. There are a number of challenges to the utility business model that we're seeing now, including the fact that electricity growth is flat, and it's been flat for a while, partly because customers have gotten more sophisticated and are able to control their power use, and partly because some of them are generating their own power from solar panels on their homes. Even industries moving away from the standard utility model to generate their own electricity. Our resource mix is also being changed, often as a result of our own doing in the name of free markets that now value hourly generating cost, but not long-term capacity commitments. So that's why we're seeing some of these nuclear plants close. Natural gas prices are lower, much more stable than in the past, and projected to remain low. Now the utility must depend on providing services in order to create revenue. And our system operators are seeing a lot of change and must operate an electric grid that depends much more now on natural gas. Natural gas pipelines and infrastructure are going to be needed in order to ensure gas supply and operate the plants at higher levels. As the load centers become more and more urbanized, with more of the nation's population now residing in urban areas, the distribution of load and generation must account for these changes. Finally, there are issues facing our electric utilities today and tomorrow that will define our future, and they are international, federal, and state as well. The Clean Power Plan, which I mentioned earlier, has created a great deal of uncertainty within the utility industry, and states are reacting to EPA's requirements with lawsuits, and as soon as the final plan comes out, I'm sure there's going to be plenty of lawsuits there as well. The additional commitments that could come from COP21, what they're calling the Universal Agreement, or that meeting of the UN Climate Change Conference, which has a goal of achieving a universal binding agreement on climate from all nations worldwide. It's going to be held, I think, in December of this year. Security and of the entire electric grid, from generator to customer to the threat of physical and cybersecurity issues on the grid, are all there for us to be strongly considering now. And I want to mention a concern about water, because water is an issue that's, the water energy interface is very important to us as we look at a region in the South that has been, that has had plentiful water supplies over the years, we're now seeing declining water usage in a number of locations, and that is going to be a determining factor in the future as to which technologies survive and which technologies don't. So today's speakers are going to talk to us more in depth about these and other issues that make changing market strategies today look vastly different from the past, and that will look vastly different in 2050. So, in conclusion, it ain't over till it's over. And as Yogi said, we made too many wrong mistakes. So I will close with that. And with one more thought. A person that I worked with for many years was Mike Morris, who was the chairman of the American Electric Power Company. And Mike used to always say that there's always three factors in everything that happens, at least in the energy business. And he said, politics trumps policy, trumps technology. I think that's very important and something we should also keep in mind. So with that, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Christopher Hagedorn, Group Executive for Strategy and Development at Peabody Energy. In this role, he has executive responsibility for global market analytics, strategy, supply chain management, portfolio optimization, and business development activities, along with emerging opportunities. He most recently served as president of the Asia and Trading, leading Peabody's global trading brokerage and Asia growth activities. He previously held several senior vice president positions at Peabody, and prior to that time, he was an associate principal at McKinsey & Company, where he provided management consulting services on operations, marketing, and business strategy topics to international clients in the energy, metals, and mining and chemical sectors. Dr. Hagedorn holds a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Washington University in St. Louis and a doctorate in chemical engineering from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Hagedorn.
Thank you, Ken, Governor, other distinguished guests. It's a pleasure to be here today and to talk to you a bit in my hometown and home state. I really appreciate the references to the St. Louis Cardinals. That's good. Maybe I can draw some analogs to the longstanding stable performance of the St. Louis Cardinals and coal. I'll say just to open the remarks that we are in truly dynamic times in the energy industry, especially here in North America, unprecedented times, and I think really for the benefit of the end consumer. And you'll see some slides that, as I walk through here, that may suggest that maybe not all those benefits are flowing through today. But it is truly an unprecedented time and dynamic. So we'll talk a little bit about coal and the role of coal in energy here in North America and globally. I think the key themes I would like to focus on: affordable energy. It's often kind of a footnote in energy policy today, but when you think about the importance of affordable energy to America and to America's economy, it truly is critical. And we'll talk a little bit about record power rates in a second, which given the oversupply and abundance of energy in North America, it's not intuitive that we're at record electricity and power rates, but we are. I'll talk a little bit about coal's important role in providing clean, low-cost power and in all of the above energy strategy. And I'm glad you brought up the Yogi Berra, when you see a fork in the road, take it, because I know we talk a lot at Peabody about an all of the above energy strategy. And when you see a fork in the road and you see opportunities and options in energy and energy supply, take it. There are many options, and all are needed as we move forward. Lastly, I'll talk about high-efficiency coal technologies and what we believe is an important path to a sustainable balance between economic development, energy access, and environmental stewardship is the continued advancement of technology. I'll talk a little bit about our past track record and the future areas of focus. So with that, low-cost electricity and energy is truly key. And I won't go through all the stats on this slide, but when you look at there are a lot of individuals in this country alone who are at an energy poverty level and who are truly in poverty. And when you look at the last bullet point on this slide, that over half of Americans have noted in a recent survey that a 20% increase in their monthly utility bill would cause a hardship. And that tells you the sensitivity to the American consumer with respect to balancing their household budgets and the importance of continued low-cost access to electricity and to power. Now, when you look at electricity rates in this country, just over the last 15 years from the year 2000, you'll see a very dynamic and upward trajectory in these rates from about 60 or 6.8 cents per kilowatt hour back in 2000 to where we sit today, north of 10 cents per kilowatt hour. It's more than a 50% increase. And when you look at household incomes, the median income has only risen about 24% in that same period of time. So for the median household, they've definitely fallen behind in their ability to afford electricity and power in this country. Now, well, I'll talk a little bit about carbon regulations. I know we'll talk more about it, and I'm sure we'll get into it in questions as well. But when we look at the EPA's Clean Power Plan, we look at it and look at the cost benefit. And you look at what we feel is not pain at the pump for the oil industry, but pain at the plug. And that the enactment of this plan will continue and arguably accelerate at a much faster rate the increases in electric power costs to the median consumer and to all consumers in the U.S. It can be damaging to the economy and to economic development and security going forward. And so we believe the answer to this is in continued gains in technology. I'll show in a few slides here that technology has helped the coal industry and the electric power sector over the last several decades achieve dramatic gains in emissions control, and we believe that technology is the path with respect to carbon as well. Now, when you look at, you might say, well, so what is the impact of coal, and why is coal often the preferred fuel, especially in other countries throughout the world that don't have the same policy regime and pressures in place as we do here in the U.S. today? When you look at the chart here, and you look from the top electricity cost states on the top left of this chart, mostly on the eastern and western seaboards, respectively. And then look at the bottom right, where Governor, your state's at the bottom right, and one of the lowest cost states in the nation. There's a very clear trend and relationship between the percent of electricity fueled by coal for each state and that cost. The more coal, the lower the cost. And so there's a reason why we have and we continue that coal represents approximately 40% of electricity generation in this country, a bit lower today, around 35% or so this year, given the low cost of natural gas. But nonetheless, it's a very important trend and the motivation for why this policy debate needs to continue, and why, as my colleagues earlier and just mentioned, 15 or so states are opposing the Clean Power Plan because of this relationship. Now, when you look at global projected energy demand, and you'll see this chart goes from 2000 to 2035, so the first 15 years, the first third or so of this chart are actual data points. Coal's actually been the fastest growing major fuel this century so far in the first 14, 15 years since 2000. You'll see oil's had good growth there in yellow. You see natural gas, a significant growth, but coal has grown faster, driven by emerging economies in China, in India, and mostly the rest of Southeast Asia. So coal is absolutely key. And so when we look at, even though the U.S. trajectory, it does not look the same as this, it does point to coal being an important baseload for the world going forward. It's not going to remain static. It will continue to grow. And so a technology answer is not only critical in other countries, but it's critical for the U.S. to be a leader and to participate in taking our technology and helping capture economic opportunity for the U.S. As this coal demand continues to rise. Now, I mentioned the environmental success story that we believe coal and the utilities have really demonstrated over the last few decades. When you look at this chart, and you look at since 1970, coal used for U.S. electric generation is up 170% or so. You look at, though, in red, the regulated emissions, SOx, NOx, particulates per megawatt hour produced from coal have dropped by 90%. And it's a dramatic trend, and it continues. You'll see it's not as if we plateaued in the year 2000. Utilities continue to install those emissions controls that are necessary to continue to achieve these trends. We've done it before. When you look back, you were sitting in the 1970s, the 1980s. You know, I don't think anyone thought, as the Clean Air Act was coming into place, that the coal would necessarily continue the gains that it did. But it did through the adoption of technologies and continued advancement of technologies. So it's very, very, very important. Now, you might say, just to build on this, that there's a lot of discussion here and elsewhere in the world about, you know, I would say more than half the time, anytime you hear the word coal, you hear dirty or pollution. Okay, but in reality, when you look at air quality in the U.S., it's an interesting chart that most people don't realize, and this is data from the American Lung Association. You know, they track obviously a lot of medical conditions, making sure to look at relationships in medical conditions and air quality. When you look at air quality and the number of days per year that each of the states in the nation has had unhealthy air days, you can see it's interesting that California stands out as nearly 5 out of every 10 days unhealthy in the red. Versus coal states, which are predominantly in the central and southern parts of the U.S., sit at 22 days, with obviously the Pacific Northwest being a bit of an exception, with being predominantly hydro-powered at only 10 days. But you look at California, and the notable difference here is California claims to have no coal, and they do. They don't have any coal-fired generation. And so you look at that and you say, well, is coal really that dirty? Is coal the primary air quality consideration that we should have in this country? So let me switch a little bit to technologies and talk a bit about the importance of technologies for coal. When you look at carbon emissions, and it is a concern, we need to continue to focus on carbon emissions. We need to continue to look at particulates, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide as well. You'll see in the chart here the progression since the 1970s versus Prairie State, which is a very close plant here nearby that Peabody helped put into place several years ago with a number of other utility partners. You'll see the types of SOx and NOx reductions versus that baseline in 1970 and the dramatic decrease that we saw in the earlier slide. But also to note that the carbon emissions rate, the CO2 emissions rate per unit power produced is up to 25% lower than in the oldest plants. And so it's also noteworthy that you can gain significant CO2 reductions just in the upgrade of the thermal efficiencies and using the best available technologies just with respect to the thermal conversion of coal itself. So very, very, very important. Now, when you look globally at carbon capture, use, and sequestration, CCUS plants, North America is in a good position. A lot of plants that are either in progress or have been put into place. You'll see other places in the world where plants are. Peabody has an equity share in GreenGen in China, in Tianjin, China, that you see there, and it just points to the fact that there is a lot of focus on technology today, but we need more. 22 large-scale plants are good, but the technology is not yet commercially viable. And so just like where we were with particulate controls, with SOx and NOx emission controls several decades ago, we need more investment and more focus globally on this technology to make sure we continue to focus on not only improving air quality from SOx, NOx, and particulates, but so that we can cost effectively and commercially mitigate carbon impacts by collecting the CO2 for either underground sequestration or for sequestration and use through things like enhanced oil recovery. It's really critical that we continue to advance these technologies, given the trajectory I showed at the beginning of my talk about coal growth globally and its criticality in helping us address the CO2 as coal demand and coal consumption continues to grow globally. So in wrapping up around technology and the theme of technology is the path going forward, I think there's no question that coal will continue to be a key part of our global energy supply. The question here in this country is, will coal continue to be a very large share, or will what we feel undue regulations continue to reduce demand for coal, making our economy that much less competitive versus others that continue to use coal? As we use more coal, we absolutely should use it more cleanly. We should continue to focus on the ultimate goal of near zero emissions, including CO2. So technology is key. And I'll just point out that I know there are a number of states that are currently advancing energy strategies, energy policies. I know in Missouri here we have a Missouri 21st Energy Plan that's starting, and I think it's really critical, though, that it's really easy these days, given that the focus, when anyone says coal, most people say, well, I don't want to talk about coal. I want to talk about solar. I want to talk about wind. But when you look at the backbone energy source that coal is, even in this country today, ignoring it, especially in a state like Missouri, where 80% of our power is from coal, is really not the best answer. The best answer is to embrace it, focus on technologies, and drive the adoption of those technologies going forward so that we have the lowest cost energy supply that we can, and we also continue to achieve the dramatic reductions in emissions that we have over the last few decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I can think of a few questions already. We'll get to that in just a minute. Our next speaker is Jeffrey P. Price, who is an expert on electric power markets and technologies. And much of his work over 4 decades has focused on technology and resource choices for the electric power sector, both in the United States and internationally. These choices have included natural gas, coal, renewables, nuclear power, and demand resources. His recent work has been on how viable energy resource portfolios can be created and sustained for an uncertain future in a changing U.S. electric power sector. Mr. Price is co-founder and managing partner of Bluewave Resources, which is a management and economic consulting firm based in Virginia. He has advised a wide range of clients on strategic policy, economic and financial issues related to energy resource markets and electric power technologies. Clients have included federal and state government agencies, technology and project developers, utilities, large energy users, equipment and resource suppliers, associations, multi-company initiatives, and multilateral organizations such as the International Energy Agency. Mr. Price holds an MBA from the University of Michigan and a BS in engineering physics from the University of Toledo. He has authored numerous published reports and articles. So Jeff, if you'll join us.
Thank you, Ken, and good afternoon. As I'm sure you're all deeply aware, as governors and state officials, you are ultimately going to be held responsible for ensuring that electric service meets the needs of your state. This requires decisions about the resources that will be used on the electric grid, and you have many more choices today than before. From coal to natural gas to nuclear, the traditional resources, to new ones such as renewables, demand response, and even more. Each of those resources is changing in ways that weren't anticipated even a few years ago. I want to talk to you today not so much about those resources, but about challenges you face as states making decisions about those resources. Those challenges really begin with increasing public demands. The traditional electric utility regulatory system was put into place to meet requirements for affordability and reliability. Energy security became a concern during the 1970s due to 2 oil embargoes on the United States. Safety became a high priority after 3 Mile Island in 1978, and also in the 1970s, the environmental movement took off. Over the last decade or so, all those concerns have remained, but new ones have been added: resilience, job creation, clean energy, and for some, empowerment to generate and sell your own electricity. All this raises important questions for you as states. How will we meet all the demands that the public now makes? What resources should be used? How will resource decisions be made? Who will make those decisions? Decision-making for all these answers faces several major challenges. The first of those challenges is that responsibilities for making those decisions, once fairly straightforward, have become balkanized. What do I mean by that? How did that happen? Well, let's look at how the industry has changed. Up through about the 1970s, the structure for the electric utility industry was fairly simple, and it truly was an electric utility industry. Local electric utilities everywhere were all vertically integrated and operated almost independently of each other, with little trade in electricity between them. Utilities were regulated primarily by state PUCs, and they used well-established cost of service regulation that had been in place, using methodologies that had been in place for many years. Importantly, there was a legal bright line between state and federal jurisdiction, but a lot has happened between then and now. Today, the industry is much more complex. It's no longer an electric utility industry. There are many diverse types of players, and electric trading is widespread with many types of energy resources. The bright line between federal and state jurisdiction is not so bright anymore. The investment community plays a much larger role in deciding what gets built and by whom. And finally, energy users themselves increasingly want to be not just consumers, but also producers of electricity, so-called prosumers, as Ken mentioned earlier. It's a very different, very complex, and very interdependent world. This slide illustrates some of the current electric power interdependencies. If your reaction looking at it is that this slide is overly complicated and hard to understand, I've gotten across the main point that I'm trying to get with this slide. And states can only affect and only have an impact on the 3 areas on the bottom of this graphic. What is important is 3 things. First, the complexities and interdependencies that it shows. Second, the very diffuse decision-making that this implies. And third, the fact that problems in any one part of this system can cascade uncontrollably and in ways that are very difficult to project throughout the entire system. That's something to be very concerned about. Another thing to be concerned about is the fact that jurisdictions in the industry are very much overlapping. There are several interconnections in North America that operate separate synchronized grids. Within each, there are separate planning regions, and some of these cut across state lines. In some parts of the country, organized wholesale markets are operated by RTOs and ISOs. Again, some of those cut across state lines and go within states. Each of those has different rules. In other regions, including much of the South, utilities are vertically integrated. Some states have both RTOs and ISOs and vertically integrated regions. States still regulate electricity distribution and retail transactions, a few states have retail competition. Because of all this, many state utility regulators that I've talked to feel they have much responsibility, but not necessarily the authority to go with that responsibility. All this makes decision-making very difficult. Now on to the second challenge. Electric power, which is usually thought of as a technology-based industry, has really become a commodity industry, and actually a multi-commodity industry. Commodities are typically traded in markets with very dynamic and hard to predict economics and pricing. All this greatly impacts electric service. What commodities am I talking about? Well, actually quite a few. Certainly the fuel commodities, natural gas, coal, uranium, petroleum, that's obvious. As Ken mentioned, water is becoming an increasing concern. And then there are the commodities that are used for infrastructure, steel and concrete, copper and aluminum. They determine the capital cost of that infrastructure. Byproducts such as carbon dioxide, gypsum, and coal ash can be sold by the industry. Even with new technologies such as photovoltaics and energy storage, we don't escape commodity economics. We are actually introducing new commodities such as lithium, rare earths, and silicon. And then probably the most important commodity of all, electricity. Commodity pricing follows ever-changing market conditions. Here is a very relevant example, the actual price paid for natural gas used for power generation over about the past 25 years. The variations shown here actually understate the real variations because these are annual averages. There's tremendous variation even within a year or a week of trading in natural gas. This kind of pricing shows trends, it shows cycles, there's volatility. All of those can change unexpectedly. Yet virtually all planning for the industry uses modeling and forecasting based on very static assumptions about commodities. How well can we forecast? Well, probably the most cited and respected projections are those of the Energy Information Administration, or EIA. They're really in many ways considered to be the gold standard. The blue line here shows the forecast of natural gas prices paid by the electric power industry from the 1994 Annual Energy Outlook of EIA. That's the outlook that was published at the very beginning of this period. The projection is generally right the first few years in the general direction, but it certainly misses a lot of very significant price shifts. EIA, since then, has made a lot of changes to its modeling approach. Have those changes improved the projections? Here are EIA's projections for every year from 1994 through 2014 for natural gas paid for by the electric power industry. We've got 94, 95, 96, and so on. Do these forecasts look like something that you can rely on? It certainly doesn't look that way to me. Please understand, I'm not trying to criticize EIA. EIA is a very professional organization, and they really have probably some of the most sophisticated and advanced modeling in the world on this. I could have illustrated this with the results of any forecaster, and probably for any commodity. EIA is just the only one that actually makes publicly available all the historical forecasts in a way that you can do this comparison. Economic forecasters make projections like this because their customers want forecasts. They demand it. They use them to plan. That's the problem. Forecast-based planning is inadequate for making decisions about the highly uncertain future of a commodity industry. Forecasting models must make fixed assumptions about how the industry works. Time and again, the reality of the industry has defied those fixed assumptions. The real world is just more dynamic. And the trend towards commoditization in electric power is not over. Currently, electricity is a commodity in wholesale electric markets. In the future, even retail markets for electricity that are regulated by states could become commoditized. You may soon be hearing about transactive energy, which is a term meant to describe how consumers that produce electricity, or prosumers, will compete in the marketplace. And the bright line between federal and state jurisdictions is likely to fade even more in reality, if not in legal terms. All this raises a host of new problems that states are increasingly going to have to wrestle with. Now to the last of the three challenges to decision-making I'm going to be talking about, new technology options. These are just a few of the electric power technologies that are advancing. And since they're all advancing, it's not just one advancing and the others holding static, there are new terms of competition that are being set up between them. How do you choose among them? Well, for that, it probably helps a great deal to understand how technology advances. For virtually all technologies, significant improvements responding to customer needs and competition are constantly being made. Game-changing breakthroughs, however, are much rarer. They tend to be hybrids of different technologies, often from completely different fields. A recent example is shale gas production, which combines two pre-existing technologies, different technologies used in the oil and gas industry, hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. It's totally transformed the global outlook for oil and gas. Almost nobody expected that until it burst upon the scene only about 7 or 8 years ago. Will electric energy storage be the next breakthrough, as many expect? Well, maybe it will be, maybe not. But it is certain that many future innovations will surprise us. That's different than the usual way that people plan for technology innovation. The usual way is a plan now called a technology roadmap. The technology developer sets cost and performance goals and then devises a step-by-step roadmap to meet those goals. If the technology has a public purpose, then the government may invest in the technology and create its own roadmap. Later on, government may provide financial incentives to help it ride through the so-called valley of death between technology promise and commercial viability. Sometimes that works, but often it doesn't. Technology development is a learning by experience process. As you're developing a technology, you develop unexpected things. Some of them are helpful, some of them show that you're on a dead end. It's very, very hard to predict. That leads to what's been called the hype cycle. Originally used to describe expectations for computer technologies, it's equally applicable to energy technologies. Technologies often go through several phases of expectation, starting with promising early R&D and publicity that creates a buzz. Excitement builds and investors flock until it becomes clear that expectations are not realistic, and negative press pushes it into the trough of disillusionment. Since Ken mentioned Yogi Berra, this reminds me of another Yogi Berra saying, "Nobody goes there anymore because it's too crowded." Over time, if the technology proves itself, expectations rise again. Not all technologies go through this hype cycle, but it is certainly common enough. What does this mean to you? There's several lessons. First, have a diverse enough portfolio that chances of a payoff are significant and risks are low. Second, recognize that exciting new technologies are often surrounded by hype. The hype is not necessarily intended to be deceptive. Enthusiasm is human nature, and nobody is more enthusiastic than an inventor. Third, often the technologies that make the most impact are the least hyped and least well known. How many here had heard of synchrophasers before Ken mentioned it earlier? Anybody here? Yet that's probably the smart grid technology that over the last 3 or 4 years has had the most impact on electric industry reliability, yet nobody has heard of it. What this means is that the buzz is not necessarily, the technology about which is the most buzz are not necessarily those for which the payoff will be the greatest. So what does all of this mean? How can states meet these challenges? Balkanized decision-making, commodity market dynamics, and technology uncertainty. The overarching principle is that you need to create the flexibility to deal with the unexpected. In the messy real world, as we've seen in the energy space time after time, the unexpected will happen. To create that flexibility, you need to address those 3 fundamental challenges, which almost nobody is doing right now. Keep your options open and diversify energy resources. Encourage innovation, but have realistic expectations. Develop effective and realistic planning methods, and simplify decision-making wherever it's possible. States are very key players in this, but they can't do it alone. Many parties need to be involved. We've really yet to begin to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And now to our cleanup hitter, I should say, who is Brad Viator, the Senior Director of External Affairs at the Edison Electric Institute. Brad is responsible for outreach to state elected officials, including governors, state legislators, and state attorneys general, among others. He also manages EEI's online advocacy community, We Stand for Energy. Brad regularly serves as a spokesman on behalf of the industry in public forums. Before coming to EEI in 2011, he was with the National Association of Realtors and focused on electoral and legislative advocacy for federal elected officials. Prior to moving to Washington, he did extensive political campaign work at the local, state, and federal levels in a number of western states. Brad has a BS from Texas A&M University and is a native of Beaumont, Texas. So join me in welcoming Brad Viator.
Thank you, and thanks for having me and taking the time. As I was told about this panel, the goals that I guess I had in mind were to talk a little bit about where I believe electricity markets are going and what concerns we see across the horizon. I'll first begin by saying who is the Edison Electric Institute. We're the trade association for the investor-owned electric utilities. We represent all the shareholder-owned guys all across the country. The sort of focus of my conversation will be our capital expenditures within the industry and what the drivers of those capital expenditures are, the impacts on the generation fleet and the electric grid as a whole, the environment and the Clean Power Plan, which is kind of the topic du jour, cyber and grid security, which is becoming ever more important, and ultimately the evolving distribution grid. So this is us. This is our spend domestically. You hear a lot of talk about jobs being offshored or what have you, and you talk about how you're going to attract jobs locally and to your state and to your economy. And we're the job that can't be exported here on in the near term. A turbine is spinning when the lights are on, and that has to be done in close proximity. So it's certainly in this era of transmission siding, as it's more and more complicated. We are domestic producers of jobs and also of power. We're also the most capital-intensive industry in the country. So don't forget about us when you're going out there and considering policies. What are the drivers of our investment? Where are we spending that $108 billion in 2015? One of the big key drivers is, which may be obvious, is environmental regulation. Regulations effectively help determine where those dollars are spent, where we need to spend them, and when we need to spend them. Low natural gas prices are really driving the day right now. I know you've heard a lot about that. But it's certainly what is making a lot of the decisions for us. The declining costs of technology, this is particularly true when it comes to renewable energy, and especially so when it comes to solar over really the last 2 or 3 years. We're investing significant amounts of money, time, and effort in figuring out how to bring those costs down and ensure that we can provide that resource to as many customers as possible. Diversification, all the eggs in one basket slide. This is one of the concerns that we worry about over the long term. We don't like, as an industry, we don't really like to model. We think that modeling is problematic. One, because nobody wants to look at us in a magazine. But the big sort of issue is, as Jeff talked about it a minute ago, models are, wrong a lot of times, and we make 10, 20, 30, 40, 50-year decisions, so it's difficult for us to do it that way. We prefer to hedge. That's effectively our game. And so as we enter this era where the economics and environmental regulations are taking some resources off the table, we get a little bit worried when we look at what commodity prices may look like in the future. So diversification, I think, is a key and something that we're driving towards, but we feel a little constrained when we talk about that. State renewable energy policies are certainly a driver. A lot of your states have these renewable energy policies, and they really do drive technology in a lot of ways. I'm not attempting to advocate for that, but I think that one certain or local example that we can talk about in that arena is actually in California right now. They have a pretty big renewable portfolio standard. I think they're trying to get to 50% renewable energy, which is pretty aggressive. But there's one piece within it where I believe it's a 10% requirement for energy storage. We believe on the utility side that is actually going to drive where a lot of that technology goes. Utilities have the balance sheet and the capacity to go out and make significant investments in storage systems, and that price, requirement and that signal is really, I believe, going to allow for those costs to come down pretty quickly over time, and I think those are things that we'll be able to apply in other states. Financial incentives, here we're talking a lot about tax credits, a lot of conversation about the investment tax credit, certainly the production tax credit, but also the investment tax credit, which is looking to change at the end of 2016. And then finally, and it is certainly not least of our concerns, that's customer demand. We are trying to switch the way that we do business to be more responsive to customers and listen to what it is that they want and try to provide products that will give them the energy sources of the future that they would like. This is that slide that illustrates natural gas market and prices. As you can see, back in 2008, we were above $12 an MMBTU, and now we're very comfortably under $4 an MMBTU. The thing that's not reflected here are the capital costs for natural gas generating units. They're relatively low, so it is a little bit less of a capital spend than some other resources, and then we've got a commodity price that's low, so it's kind of a perfect storm that is leading us to invest more and more in natural gas. But the flip of it is, and I think the point that was made here earlier, is that we are exposed to that commodity as we get more and more invested in it. Also on the cost side, you're really seeing the cost of solar PV just drop to the floor. There are a lot of kind of questions of how much lower it can really go over time, and some of the proponents on the solar side of extending the ITC will suggest that there's no room for the cost to drop any further. But the way that we see it, while that may be true over the short or even the medium term, the technology is just getting so much better and so much more efficient that there's really nowhere else for prices to go. This is a story that I don't think gets told very much. When you hear of utilities, when you hear of solar, you usually think of the rooftop solar space, particularly the big rooftop solar leasing businesses that are out there and garnering a lot of attention. But utilities really are the leader when it comes to solar power. 60% of all installed capacity is large-scale, utility-scale solar, those big farms you see driving down the highway between cities. We are expected to invest about $9 billion a year in solar power from 2014 to 2020, which is certainly significant. In 2014, nearly 4 gigawatts of large-scale solar capacity was installed. And the utilities really are the leader in both the large scale and also the medium scale. You're beginning to see proliferation of community scale solar power and solar capacity. Utilities are really the ones that are leading the way. And while the costs of PV have certainly dropped in the residential rooftop space precipitously, down to $3.66 a watt, the same is true on the large scale side, and we cost a little less than half as much in large scale. So we're certainly advocating for, as you consider renewable energy going forward, that you would consider it on a cost basis and certainly give strong consideration to the utility participating in this marketplace. Our generating fleet is also just getting significantly cleaner due to technology changes, due to just resource adjustments. We are really seeing a significant change in our environmental impact. As you can see from this chart from the EIA, which Jeff talked about a little bit, so we will dismiss the fact that they were wrong on all that other stuff and say they're right here, that we expect renewable sources to more than triple between 2010 and 2040. Again, a lot of this is certainly in the solar piece and into the wind piece kind of becomes dependent on the out years of what happens in the storage space and kind of how we're able to manage those adjustments and changes in technology. The environment and the Clean Power Plan, another key driver to the investments that we're making right now. These are the environmental and regulatory challenges we are looking at in 2015 and beyond. Significant challenges in air. You guys are familiar with the mercury and air toxic standard, which even though the opponents of that rule won the court case, the investments had already been made. So the impact on MATS is certainly being felt. A lot of others in the airspace, as well as the Clean Power Plan, climate, water, land and natural resources, waste and chemical management. We're facing regulation all across the board, and as former EPA administrator once told me, we recognize that the utilities have a limited number of retrofit dollars, and so what we want to do going forward is try to figure out that ways that we can maximize those retrofit dollars. So within that $108 billion a year, significant portion is certainly in the retrofit space and certainly in the compliance space. As the point was made earlier, that emissions are decreasing significantly, and that conversation was a little bit about NOx and SOx, where we have made really serious gains. But the story that doesn't get told enough is how much we're improving in the CO2 space as well. Not only are our emissions going down, but the intensity of those emissions are also going down significantly due to, again, technology and resource changes. The Clean Power Plan. I have another slide somewhere that says the Clean Power Plan, forget what you knew. The way that the plan was proposed versus what we actually saw put into place are significantly different. It was designed to be a state-based plan where states were going to ultimately make significant decisions to meet these goals that the EPA had designed. I think through the year of comments through many of the people in this room, many people in industry, many people on the dais, we saw significant changes to that rule that are now back to a more traditional approach to environmental regulation from the EPA that is focused on units more so than it is meeting these sort of hard and fast numbers. There are still a number of points at which the states can, would, and should engage, particularly as it comes to designing plans going forward. And if you're moving towards a mass-based plan, for example, being able to make choices of which plants are must-runs versus which plants could be put into retirement. But it's a very different rule than was initially proposed. The big picture when it comes to this rule is that it is now unit-based. Units must decide how and when to achieve reductions, and depending on whether on which type of compliance plan you go with, are you going to just achieve reductions, or are you going to go out and procure or buy credits or allowances? That is a significant change from the way we were thinking about it, and I think that last point on this slide is a pretty significant one, that the EPA assumes that a national trading system will in fact emerge, and so there will be, from EPA's point of view, some sort of trading system. Compliance period and deadline, as you can see, we are getting pretty close to the initial submittal. You guys are very well aware, as was talked about earlier, there are court challenges. We will see what happens there, particularly as it relates to any sort of stay that may be granted. But in the absence of those things, these are sort of the deadlines to consider going forward. Cyber and grid security, this is something that is becoming increasingly more important to us as we're seeing a lot of issues out there. One, because we have access and are the guarantors of our customers' information. We have a bunch of data when it comes to just general customer data, also credit card information and things like that. So we are spending a significant amount of time, effort, and energy in this space to both protect our customers and their sensitive information, and also look at the sort of bigger system risks that are out there. This is the way we like to think of the threat landscape. On the left side of the ledger up the likelihood chart is things like a cyber attack or physical attack, which we consider to be inevitable in some capacity. Then as you look over on the x-axis, on the consequence side of things, there are other big challenges out there, be they attacks from foreign states, a nuclear attack, or some of the electromagnetic pulse or geomagnetic disturbance issues that you hear a lot about going forward. Those are certainly concerns and are big system concerns, but because they, while high in consequence, low in likelihood, we have to ensure that we're allocating resources to prepare for those things appropriately. And given that I'm running over time, I will fly through this a little bit. The top line there is grid security is a top priority. The electric utility industry is really one of the leaders when it comes to partnering with the government and figuring out how to move forward and share information. We've created this electric subsector coordinating council with Department of Energy, with DHS. We are in talks about adding more sort of government officials to that piece, along with CEOs of electric utilities all across the country, to just share information and prepare for these threats. And the last piece really is the evolving distribution grid. As technology changes, we have to move from a place that was designed for one-way communication into a place that will allow, enable, and two-way communication through these smart grid investments, electric vehicles, the Nest thermostats, and other like devices. So we're making significant investments into the electric grid so that we can be prepared for those changes that are coming forth. So with that, I thank you for the time and look forward to questions.
Well, let me ask if Governor Beshear will come up for just a minute. It would be remiss of me to be chairing a session like this and to have an expert in the audience like Governor Beshear, who has run an energy producing state for 8 years amid all the chaos and issues that you've just heard about. And you can see this is a very complicated issue, very complicated problem. So, Governor, if you would just give us a few of your perspectives after 8 years as the governor of the great state of Kentucky.
Well, first of all, expert is not a word I would use to describe me in this area, but I can tell you this. Earlier this afternoon, we talked about job displacement by technology. And when you think of that, we were thinking 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, what's it going to look like? Well, what they're talking about, folks, is today. This is not tomorrow or 10 years from now. It's today. This is happening today in so many ways. This marketplace is changing so rapidly. And as you heard Brad say, their decision-making, I mean, the biggest purchasers of the resources to create power are our utilities. And their decisions are 20 and 30-year decisions. And they're making them right now. So this changing landscape it's so rapid right now that no one knows for sure where it's going. When I look back at my 8 years, I mean, the changes I've seen just in 8 years. First year I came in, you know, Kentucky had never had a comprehensive energy plan. And so we got together and we put one together. And I looked at it 3 years later and it was already outdated. So many of the things weren't even realistic anymore because of the changing landscape. You know, from a governor's perspective, and you're looking at this from 30,000 feet, there's three things that you look at. What's it going to cost my Kentucky family to have power in the home? What can they afford? Secondly, what's it going to cost my Kentucky businesses? I got to make sure I keep those businesses because those businesses supply the jobs that that family needs to pay their bills and to have a good quality of life. And so what's that rate have to be? How low can we keep that rate to keep those businesses and to grow those businesses? Because it's a competitive environment. And thirdly, you have to factor on top of all of that, what effect on the environment are you going to have depending upon what decisions you make? And folks, that third one is just as important as the other two. This is a balancing act. It always has been. Different people strike different balances, and that's, you know, it's judgmental in nature, but it is a balancing act. And you've got to look at all of those things. Where we are today, I told you up here earlier today, I mean, in the course of about 18 months over the last 2 years, we lost almost 9,000 coal miner jobs, mostly in eastern Kentucky. Why? Well, a combination of factors. Regulation in terms of proposed regulation. I mean, these rules aren't even in yet, as we all know, but they're on the table. And guess who's having to make decisions about what kind of plants to build that are going to produce that energy for the next 30 years? Utilities. And they're making them right now. They don't know what these regulations are going to be. And so they've got to make decisions right now based upon a lot of moving parts and uncertainty out there in the marketplace. So those regulations certainly are affecting us, even though they're not even effective yet. Secondly, it's marketplace. You saw what's happened to the price of natural gas because of the fracking process and the discovery of the new fields. I mean, from $12 to $2. I've forgotten what it costs right now to mine coal in eastern Kentucky, but I think it's about $5 at least. You can't compete right now with that price of natural gas. So all of those factors are coming together. As Brad mentioned, a perfect storm, but obviously for Kentucky, it's a real hurricane. And they're causing a displacement in our industry in Kentucky. And it's not a temporary displacement. You know, you're never going to see, I'm a believer that the coal industry is always going to be with us, and it's always going to be an important industry. But I've come to the conclusion it's never going to employ the number of people that it once employed. But all I would ask the industries that are involved in the energy sector to do is to be thoughtful and be careful. Because I will guarantee you that the next place that regulators are going to look is the natural gas industry. You've already seen studies and arguments about the fracking process and the possible environmental damage that the fracking process could do to the environment. I would predict to you that in a very short future year, you're going to see proposed regulations coming out that will do something of a limiting nature to that kind of process, if not propose to do away with that process. So here's the issue that Brad's folks deal with. I've got to make a decision today about whether I'm going to go build a coal-fired power plant or a gas-fired power plant. Well, I mean, you look at the numbers, what decision is there to make? But if they end up with all gas-fired power plants, two things are going to happen. Number one, strangely, and I don't know how, but strangely, the price of natural gas is going to go up. It just happens. And I'm sure it'll just be the marketplace, but it's going to go up. And I think right now that the breaking point between coal and natural gas may be, is it around $5 or, I mean, give or take, some close enough for government work. And right now it's $2.50 or $3, and coal is more than that. But at some point, the price of that natural gas is going to go up, number one, because of that marketplace, but number two, because of more regulation that's going to eventually hit that industry. And so these utilities right now are in a bind, trying to figure out how to make that decision and trying to keep that balance. The other thing they're in a bind about is the fact that under these new proposed regulations, with the clean power regulations, the one on building new coal-fired power plants is written such that I'm not sure there'll ever be a new coal-fired power plant built in the United States with the requirements and the goals that you have to hit. Now, the one on existing power plants, coal-fired power plants, the original draft that came out, we in Kentucky felt like, you know, we've got some room. I think we can figure out a way to make some of this work. The goals were such that I think maybe we can figure out a way to hit these. But of course, they got all the comments in, and then the final rule that came out looked nothing like the proposed rule and makes it impossible for us to keep a lot of existing coal-fired power plants open. We're one of the states that's going to fight it. I mean, we have to fight it. It's not because we don't like the environment. We do. And we're just as committed to clean air and clean water and protecting our land as anybody else. We're also committed to jobs. And we've got to continue that balance between economic development and job creation and keeping businesses here in the United States as opposed to running them all off to China where they're building 10 coal-fired power plants a day, or to some other place where they can get cheaper electricity. So, you know, this is a now issue. This is not a 10-year off issue. This is so important right now. Thank you.
This is a very complicated issue, as we all have seen over the past hour and a half, and we certainly are running over. Diane, I don't know if we have time for any questions, or should we? No? Okay. All right. Okay, well, I'm going to throw it open to you, and don't everybody jump at once, but if there's a question out there, we'll take one before we have to pack it up here. Lots of issues. There is one right back here. Yes, sir.
My name's Greg Webb, and I work for the Archer Daniels Midland Company, where we are an agriculture crop originator as well as a manufacturer. And some of our larger plants, we utilize cogeneration, combined heat and power. Do you see a future for that kind of technology to be incentivized or even advocated in a much stronger way than it seems to have since this kind of technology became available 20 years ago?
Brad, you want to take that?
Yeah, can you guys hear me? One, I'll say that there's certainly been a lot of interest in combined heat and power, particularly from large industrial users. And what we're seeing in the marketplace is it operating mostly as a displacement of other utility costs. I think that it is something that's quite promising. I think that as it relates to offsetting other utility costs, it has a very bright future. I don't know what the appetite is in the Congress for incentives on that front right now. I guess that could always change, but I think that it will continue to be significant option, particularly in places where you're seeing electricity prices increase. And I'm talking mostly about New England and on the coast. It becomes a heck of a lot easier to offset those investments when you're dealing with higher electricity prices.
Either of the other panelists comment? Chris? Or
Sure. Is that on? Okay, good. Well, I'll just say from a global perspective, looking at the competitiveness of industry, I think the types of low-cost energy for your process, it's absolutely essential for competitiveness. You know, whether it's here or in plants in India that I've seen, in order to stay competitive, you need to make sure that you have low-cost power. And you know, there's some smaller applications where, you know, small coal-fired plants that have switched to natural gas, but where you have a large energy demand for processing, like cement or agriculture, there really is going to be a competitive shift if you have to move away from that technology. So I think to remain competitive, you need to continue to use coal in that capacity.
Jeff?
There certainly has been a lot of attention that's been given over the years to cogeneration, starting with PURPA, the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act in 1978, which was the original impetus for that. Certainly, as Brad said, one of the primary impetuses is when you have high electricity rates, it also depends on exactly what the rate structure is. But in order to have cogeneration, you need two things. You need an electric load and you need a thermal load, and they need to be relatively flat. That doesn't happen everywhere. There's definitely opportunities. It's a niche opportunity where you have those two things. During the 80s, after PURPA was first passed, there was a tremendous amount of attention to it. A lot of people running around the country trying to build what were then called PURPA machines. And you know, they found a lot of opportunities for it, and a lot of them were built. There's still more opportunities, but at least from what I've seen, a lot of the really best opportunities have already been taken.
All right, well, with that, let me just thank Governor Beshear once again for his comments. Let's give the panel a big hand, and we're adjourned.